Before we begin tonight's journey through forgotten history, take a moment to settle in. What time is it where you are? And where in the world are you listening from tonight? Let us know in the comments. We read every single one. And if you enjoy these quiet, slow stories from the past, don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell so you'll never miss another episode of Boring History for Sleep. Now, breathe deep and let the past unfold, one quiet step at a time. Asterix, long before sunrise, when the courtiers of France still slept beneath embroidered sheets and the castle halls echoed only with the drip of melting wax, King Charles VI of France woke in terror. It was 1393. Outside, the wind howled low across the Seine. Inside the chambers of St. Paul, the king clutched his chest, his face drenched in sweat, as if he'd run through fire in his sleep. He had dreamt of fire, of a girl in white, standing in the royal orchard beneath a cherry tree. Her eyes were covered with silk. When she removed the blindfold, her eyes were black pits. Then the flames came, leaping from the roots, devouring the branches, until the girl herself crumbled like burnt paper. He woke, screaming. Charles VI had always been a fragile man, even before the madness, but this dream would take root deeper than the others. He believed it was not a dream, but a message. He told his physician, who offered herbs. He told his confessors, who offered prayers. But the king demanded more. He summoned every court astrologer, mystic, and monk who dared offer interpretations. And by midday, after incense was burned and texts read aloud, an uneasy consensus formed. The girl in the dream represented the kingdom. Her blindness foretold betrayal. The flames meant contagion, moral or divine. And worst of all, she was young. That very evening, the king issued a decree. The royal council, still recovering from a masquerade disaster that had nearly claimed the king's life weeks earlier, was too frightened to oppose him. From that day forward, any unmarried girl in the kingdom, particularly those born during inauspicious hours, as listed by royal astrologers, was to be registered, observed, and gently guided away from vice. No one knew what guided meant, but the bureaucracy did what it always does. It took the vague and turned it into policy. By spring, clerks in Paris, Rouen, Lyon, and Orleans began compiling lists of girls aged 6 to 14. The chosen method was simple. Local priests were to report all baptisms of girls born between specific moon phases. These girls were called les felies, the watched ones. Some families were relieved. They assumed it was a kind of royal blessing. Others hid their daughters. Soon, hiding became impossible. The girls were marked for education, which meant removal. Entire convent schools were emptied of older novices to make room for these children. Many were relocated to stone dormitories called maisons de rêve, dream houses, a cruel irony given that they were built on the basis of a king's nightmare. The rooms were clean but sparse. Stone walls, narrow beds, and a silence enforced by curfews. The girls were taught embroidery, liturgical songs, call, and silence. One of the first girls recorded under this policy was Isabeau Fournier, age 11, from a village outside Tours. She was taken one morning in April after a new curate declared her birth aligned with a dangerous Saturnine hour. Her mother wept, clutching Isabeau's apron strings as the priest explained that it was for the safety of the realm. Isabeau's story is only known because she later wrote cheers after her release a single letter to her cousin, detailing her years in the maison near Reims. In it, she spoke of waking every hour to bells reciting verses from Psalms, but not understanding the language, being forbidden to speak to any girl older than herself, and once seeing a girl punished for crying, forced to kneel in a basin of saltno. Formal charges were brought against the girls. There were no trials, no hearings, only lists and transfers. But for the girls inside, time moved slowly, and dreams ironically were discouraged. They were trained to be pious, obedient, and unseen. Back at court, King Charles took comfort in reports of progress. The astrologers told him the dream had weakened in the stars. The fires in his visions no longer reached the girl's feet. In response, a second decree was drafted. It proposed that once a girl reached the age of 16, she could be returned home only if her family proved she had no history of illness, no disruptive dreams, and no signs of spiritual inversion. The term was never defined. Some believe it referred to moodiness. Others believe it was an early way of diagnosing what would now be called independent thinking. Meanwhile, those who aged out without approval were quietly moved to nunneries or made wards of the royal estate. Their identities dissolved into monastic rosters. Of the 3,000 girls initially taken between 1393 and 1395, less than 200 ever returned home. The records, accused, preserved in fragments in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, show curious patterns. Girls with fathers in trade were more likely to be released. Those whose fathers were deceased or illiterate rarely saw their daughters again. Some towns, especially those in Burgundy, complied with such zeal that they began sending additional girls. Beyond the quota, it became a silent policy of control. And it all started from a single night's dream. But what was it about that dream that haunted Charles so deeply? Why did a fleeting image, one flame, one faceless girl set in motion a policy that imprisoned thousands? Could it be that he recognized something, someone, in her? Asterisk, the courtyard at the Maison de Rêve Inn. Reims was a square of packed earth, ringed by pale stone walls and narrow, barred windows. In the center stood an apple tree, one of the few touches of life in a place where girls were not allowed to laugh, and where silence was treated as an accomplishment. Isabeau Fournier often sat at the edge of the courtyard in the early mornings. It was the only time they were allowed outside without direct supervision. The air in spring was cold and still, and the tree, though half dead, remained the only thing not assigned a purpose. No one told them the rules. They learned them by watching others be punished. You couldn't sing unless instructed. You couldn't speak to a girl over 13 unless spoken to. You couldn't share food. You couldn't walk in pairs after dusk. You had to sit with both feet flat and your hands folded on your lap, even while outdoors. Each girl had a number sewn into the lining of her apron. Cybele's was 0872. The lower numbers were reserved for those of higher birth. She once saw a girl with a single-digit number cry after being assigned to scrub the stone floors with a vinegar rag. That girl, number 0004, was the daughter of a distant cousin to a nobleman. She disappeared after that. No one spoke her name. Again, back in Paris, Charles VI's court was now obsessed with the idea of spiritual contagion, following the Black Death and the growing influence of millenarian movements. Many clerics whispered that morality itself could be spread like disease, especially through the impressionable organs of young women. A Dominican friar named Brother Elian Duvent, who had once been an apothecary before turning to scripture, claimed he had discovered a way to test the conscience of a girl through her pulse. He was invited to court. He declared that any girl whose pulse raised when shown a burning candle was inwardly volatile. This, according to Elian, was a sign of unclean thought. What followed was a wave of new admissions to the Mason system. Girls as young as 6 were brought in, not for anything they'd done, but for how they reacted to light. Some cried. Some were simply confused, but a heartbeat was faster than words. And so, more rooms were built. More priests were sent out. Inside the maisons, sphere became routine. Isabeau's letter described how every Sunday morning, the girls would line up in the chapel barefoot, eyes lowered. Nun named Sue Jean would read from a book of parables. many of which had been rewritten. Okay? In one, a girl who questioned her father was turned into salt. Okay? In another, a girl who wandered into a garden and plucked hay. Single fig was devoured by birds. The message was clear. Curiosity was dangerous. Silence was safety. Still, Isabeau remained quietly observant. She noticed things. Okay? How some of the older girls communicated by blinking or dropping buttons in patterns. Okay? How one of the younger girls carved tiny symbols into the wood under her bed using a sharpened fishbone. She also noticed that every few weeks a small cart arrived after dark and left before dawn. The next morning, at least one bed would be empty. There was no screaming, no goodbyes, just absence. Years later, Isabeau learned the cart belonged to a convent near Troyes that was unofficially repurposed as a final house, a place for those deemed spiritually incompatible with society. These were not official prisons. They didn't need to be. The girls had no charges, no trials, okay? And no one to question their removal. Even more unnerving were the letters. Once a year, each girl was instructed to write a letter of gratitude to the king. Isabeau described these as hollow documents, phrases written in script none of the girls had practiced before, copied from chalk lines left on their desks. One girl, Marguerite, wrote a real letter, said she begged to see her mother. She wrote it in her own words. She was gone the next day. Back at court, Charles VI's madness continued in waves. He sometimes believed he was made of glass and would not let people touch him. Other times, he would shout that the orchard in his dream was on fire again, in a rare, lucid moment. He visited a chapel and reportedly whispered to the confessor. They walk beneath the apple trees. Their shadows burn before their feet. He issued another decree shortly after, requiring that all girls in the Mason system have their hair cut short. Hair, it was believed, was a ladder for the devil, as one cleric put it. Long braids were viewed as sensual, vain, or defiant. So, the nuns lined the girls up in rows and cut their hair to the scalp. No mirrors were allowed, but the fallen curls were gathered in burlap and burned in the courtyard. The smell lingered for days. In a strange twist of history, this act meant to suppress was what triggered an outcry from several influential women at court, not because they disagreed with the practice, but because many of the hair types being burned were of excellent quality, not repurposed for wigs. Thus began one of the most absurd scandals of the era, the Mech controversy, the lock controversy, in which several Parisian nobles petitioned to have the hair of Mason girls harvested and sent to royal perruquiers. It was denied publicly, but records suggest at least 2 shipments were made. Meanwhile, Isabeau and the others continued their routine bells, halt, kneeling, silence, and the ghostly absence of names. One winter night, when she was about 14, Isabeau snuck out of her bed during the storm. She crept to the edge of the courtyard and touched the bark of the apple tree. In her letter, she said it was the first thing that had not changed since she'd arrived. She stayed there until her feet went numb, then returned before the morning bell. She was never caught. She described it as the only moment in all those years that felt truly her own. And yet, one question lingers, one that Isabeau herself posed in her letter. Was the dream the cause of our capture, or merely its excuse? By the time Isabeau Fournier turned 16, she had forgotten the sound of her own laughter. Not that it had been taken forcibly, but simply, quietly, worn away. Like chalk beneath the wet cloth. It had been over 5 years since she'd arrived at the Maison de Rêve near Reims. 5 winters of prayer, of linen chores, of kneeling until her knees peeled, of learning silence as if it were a form of breathing. She had also survived. Many girls had not. Some had vanished. Others had fallen ill in the damp, stone-walled dormitories. A few lost their minds entirely. One girl, Lenny, began speaking in tongues during Mass and was quietly removed. The nuns said she had gone to a better place, but her shoes remained under the bed for weeks. Still, Isabeau endured, and because she was quiet, compliant, and clever enough not to cry, she was permitted to join the older girls in what the nuns called domestic proving. These were rituals of skilled table setting, ink making, simple healing tonic saw designed to prepare the girls for reintegration. But reintegration was rare. A document now buried in the National Archives titled Les Rails Day Reintegrees lists only 3.2% of the girls ever released back to their families. The majority were reassigned to convents, charity kitchens, or permanent, quiet orders where speech was restricted by design. Isabeau was one of the exceptions. She never knew why. Perhaps it was because her letter writing was elegant, her embroidery even, her obedience absolute. Or perhaps more darkly, her removal was due to overcapacity. By 1399, France was at war again. Resources were thin, and the Mazins were considered a financial burden. Girls who had aged out and caused no incident were now quietly released. On a cool morning in late October, Isabeau was given a wool cloak, a small bag of rye flour, tea, and an envelope marked with a wax seal. She was escorted by a stable boy to the edge of her original village, though not to her family home. Instead, she was dropped at the parish gates, instructed to hand the envelope to the priest and wait. Inside the envelope was a document of release signed, not by the king, but by a minor scribe under the Office of Astral Wellness. It included a list of conditions. She could not leave her village for 5 years. She must remain unmarried for 1 year. She must attend confession weekly. And most oddly, she was instructed never to speak of her time in the mason. The priest glanced at the paper once and nodded. He offered no welcome. No one was sent to fetch her mother. She stood in the church vestibule for 2 hours until her uncle arrived. Having been sent word, he said her mother had died the previous winter of grief and breath. Her younger brother was working in a tannery 2 towns over. No one had waited for her. Her return to civilian life was not a homecoming. It was a re-entry into a world that had changed without her hand, perhaps had never wanted her back. Isabeau lived quietly for years, working as a midwife's apprentice and never marrying. But she carried a memory of the apple tree, the salt punishments, and the strange, unreadable silence of the girls she left behind. Years later, during a period of illness, she wrote a single letter to her cousin, who had since moved to Orleans and become a teacher. The letter is now preserved in a private collection. It's faded with time, but legible. In it, she wrote, "We were made to believe we were dangerous because we were born at the wrong hour. But I wonder if it was not the world itself that feared us, not for what we had done, but for what we might learn, what we might question, what we might remember." Okay? And yet, she also confessed to confusion. She wondered, even then, if the king truly believed in the dream more, if the dream had been a convenient veil for something more ancient, more fragile. Fear of girls who think. At court, Charles VI's madness never fully faded, suffered delusions, until his death in 1422. His dream, once a fiery warning, was later dismissed by his successors as a symptom. But the policies it birthed left behind a paper trail of thousands of names, dates, and relocations. Most of those girls vanished into history, unnamed and unmarked. It wasn't until centuries later, in the archives of the Abbey de Saint-Denis, that a librarian cataloging faded scrolls came across a ledger bound in calfskin. On the inside was written, "For His Majesty's protection, the girls of the Fire Dream." The ledger listed 3,212 entries. Only 187 were marked as released. The rest was simply crossed out, some with ink, some with wax, some with blood. We often speak of wars, treaties, and kings, but rarely of what happened between dreams and Policy, rarely of how fear, when dressed as religion or wrapped in parchment, could transform into a silent machine. One that took girls like Isabeau, turned them into warnings, and erased them with ceremony. And the deeper question remains, what do we believe today because of someone else's nightmare? Asterisk, it began with a ledger, not a battle, not a scandal, just a neatly lined page in a city office in Milan, dated the 4th of March, 1602. With a notation in black ink, liable, Julia C., age 7, assessed for 2 soldi per quarter. There is nothing unusual in the handwriting, nothing emotional, just a name, an age, a number, and a sum. But that simple entry marked the beginning of a slow and forgotten policy, one that turned orphaned girls into line items, then assets, and finally, liabilities too expensive to be allowed freedom. The practice was not formally announced. It was never debated in council or preached from the pulpit. Like so many things in late Renaissance Italy, it grew from necessity, wrapped in bureaucracy. Milan, then under Spanish rule, was recovering from years of economic drain. Wars, plagues, poor harvest had hollowed out the coffers. Officials sought to tax every corner of life: salt, windows, beards. But the most reliable income came not from the powerful, but from the powerless. Widows were common in the city's cramped quarters, but orphaned children, especially girls, were a fiscal nuisance. They could not work. They could not serve in the military. They consumed grain and space, and occasionally, when left unsupervised, wandered the markets barefoot and silent, drawing the pity of others and the suspicion of priests. And so, sometime around the turn of the 17th century, a quiet decree began to circulate through Milan's parish offices. Let it be known that those girls left without father or male guardian shall be considered wards of the city's treasury, and may, as necessity dictates, be taxed for their care and held until repayment is made or service rendered. That meant the city would house them, but not for free. Families who took in orphan girls would be billed, and if no family took them in, the girls were registered as municipal dependents, subject to seizure, relocation, and, eventually, work assignments. No one called it imprisonment. They called it custodial placement. But the girls were not free to leave. The places they were sent to varied. Some were convents, some workhouses, some purpose-built dormitories outside the city. But they shared common traits: gates, records, and silence. The case of Julia C., the little girl listed in the ledger, offers one of the earliest full examples of the policy in motion. Julia's father, a cooper, died of lung fever. Her mother, who had no dowry and no male relatives, attempted to keep her home, but the parish office declared her unable to meet Julia's obligation of care. Within days, 2 clerks appeared with a cart and a record scroll. Her mother was made to sign a receipt, assumption of guardianship. The bought paper was marked with a wax seal, a stamp of the eagle, and the phrase Dominium Temporale. Julia was now officially municipal property. Asterisk. She was sent to Casa del Umili, a stone building just beyond the western walls of the city. Up there, among 140 other girls, she began a life of repetitive prayer, thread work, and rote memorization. She was taught to read, but only catechisms. She was allowed to write, but only practice letters and thank you notes to donors. She was allowed to speak, but only in Latin prayers or rehearsed responses. Each girl had a debt assigned to her. Name, it was rarely paid. Families who took girls in either to adopt or employ were encouraged to assume this debt. But because the sum grew each quarter and included food, water, and candle fees, few did. A girl could be sponsored for 6 lire per year, but this only earned her the right to clean her shoes and more blankets. Julia stayed inside for 11 years. She grew from a silent 7-year-old to a tall, soft-voiced girl of 18. Then, her file was over 20 pages thick. It included her growth measurements, punishments received, embroidery assessments, and a curious entry that simply read, "Prone to dreaming aloud during afternoon silence. Watchful." This note was enough to delay her discharge for 3 more years, not because it was dangerous, but because girls who spoke in sleep were considered less likely to adjust peaceably into domestic service. The policy had no legal basis, but in a system where people were valued by records, any mark even imagined could mean years of additional confinement. The girls rarely saw coins, but their value was meticulously recorded. On the walls of the Casa's office hung a chart listing the going rates for different ages: ages 4 to 6, 1 lira, ages 7 to 9, 1.5 lira, ages 10 to 12, 2 lira, ages 13 to 15, 2.5 lira, ages 16 plus. Market evaluation only. Market evaluation meant their usefulness was subjective. Those with sewing skills were lent to workshops. Those with clear skin were offered to households as nursemaids. Those deemed melancholic were sent to the dye basins or laundry halls. No girl chose her path. Some tried to escape. Few succeeded. One girl, Luciana F., broke a window and ran. She was found days later in a baker's cellar trying to eat raw flour. She was returned and assigned triple kitchen duty. The casa had no need for walls with spikes or iron bars. It had contracts, paper, and the dull thread of debt. But perhaps the most chilling part was what came next. When Julia finally reached the age of 21, she was offered a contract, not of freedom, but of transfer. She could be discharged only if she signed a new agreement to serve 10 years in a textile mill outside Cremona. The wages would go to the city. Her food and lodging would be deducted from her debt. She was told, "You are not a prisoner, child. You are a ledger that is not yet balanced," she signed. We know this only because a merchant's widow named Alessandra Piazzi owned shares in the Cremona textile mill, later wrote to her cousin in Florence, enclosing a copy of Julia's transfer contract as evidence of the city's fine organizational habits. That copy survived. It is now kept in a leather-bound portfolio in a university archive under the dull label Milanese Domestic Transfers. 1592, 1620. But the real story is not the paper, it's the silence. The door, the way a child could become. A calculation. It's how the space she occupied, the candle she burned, the prayer she memorized, could be turned into units of debt. How those debts multiplied until the city, over decades, forgot to be ashamed of it. And so, we return to the original ledger. Line 4, page 2. A name, Julia C. beside it. Satisfied. But was she? By the early 1620s, the practice of cataloging orphan girls in Milan had become so deeply normalized that it no longer required justification. What began as a fiscal policy born out of desperation had become an administrative tradition. Officials no longer asked whether it was right to assign tax value to a child. They only asked how to standardize the process. And so, 1823, Stilwa Vanciel was formed the office for girls. It was a small room tucked into a side hallway of the Palazzo della Ragione, just a few paces away from where legal contracts were notarized. Inside, 3 clerks sat at desks with drawers full of forms, each with pre-written fields: name, estimated age, parish of origin, condition of teeth, level of literacy, tone of disposition. Girls without fathers, particularly those whose mothers could not read or write, were processed here. The forms were sometimes filled out in their presence, sometimes not. The girls were rarely asked to speak. If there were too many girls in a given month, some were rounded up. This was done discreetly, often through friendly visits from parish priests or the offering of free bread near busy alleys. Once inside the gates of the Casa degli Umili or one of its sister institutions, the girl's status shifted. She was no longer an unclaimed orphan, but state property under civic care. And like all property, she could be borrowed, leased, or reassigned in a ledger dated June 1626. We find the record of Maria Caterina T., age 12. Her record includes a note requested by the House of Sforza for holiday service, 1-month term, returned in fair condition. Returned in fair condition, like a rented cart or a borrowed vase. These records did not list emotions. Appear no notations for weeping, fear, joy, or relief. Only summaries of conduct: docile, unsuitable for lace, accused of humming. The city, eager to maximize returns on its youth surplus, began issuing work licenses to merchants, allowing them to apply for temporary use of girls for tasks deemed civilly beneficial. These included needlework, bread shaping, paper pressing, and, in rare cases, helping to prepare colored inks for printing presses. Each girl's labor was tracked and deducted from her debt, though the math rarely worked in her favor. For example, if a girl stitched 12 handkerchiefs in 1 week at 1 soldi per piece, she would earn 12 soldi, but her board, ink, candles, food, and moral instruction were valued at 18 soldi per week. The deficit was then added to the next month's tally. It was an economy of endless owing. A merchant's journal from 1627 contains this reflection: the girls of the state are useful. They do not complain, but they cost more than they produce. Still, the city insists we treat them as blessings to the order. I prefer linen, okay? And so, the system endured, not because it made financial sense, but because it provided control. Control over the bodies of the poor. Control over the movements of the unwanted, okay? And, more subtly, control over how a city defined virtue. There were some who opposed it, though rarely in writing. The most well-known case is that of Monna Clarice de la Torre, a widow who ran a household for elderly women on the northern outskirts of Milan. She began, quietly, to take in orphan girls and refused to report them. She offered no receipts, no forms. She claimed, when asked, that the girls were her nieces. In truth, most had no known relatives. In 1629, Monna Clarice was summoned before the Ufficio del Fancio. She brought with her a young girl named Bettina, perhaps 8 years old. Bettina had been abandoned outside a butcher's shop. Clarice was asked to produce her documents. She said she had none. When pressed further, she replied, "If you wish to charge the girl a tax, you must first teach her to read the invoice." The clerk, reportedly amused, let her go. But 2 weeks later, officials returned to her home with an order of seizure. 3 girls were taken. Clarice was fined 14 lira and placed under a year's surveillance. The story caused a quiet stir in the San Marco parish. For a time, donations to the orphanage system dropped. A few merchants spoke in her defense, but the city held firm. They insisted were safest in the care of formal institutions, not random widows. Ironically, just months later, the city was struck by plague. The epidemic of 1613, known as the Great Plague of Milan, ravaged the orphan houses. Over a third of the girls perished. Many died nameless. Records show entire pages marked simply, "All deceased." Room cleared. The economic records, however, continued. Ledgers from 1631 began to include posthumous notations. Debt canceled upon death. Girl who died before 21 was no longer a burden. She was simply removed from the system financially, bureaucratically, and, eventually, historically. Yet, not all were lost to oblivion. Giulia, Sitha, girl we met in section 1, survived. After her 10 years at the textile mill near Cremona, she was finally permitted to marry. The permission itself cost 3 lira and required her husband to sign a bond promising to keep her within city limits. She married a baker, named Lorenzo. They lived modestly. She never had children of her own, but her name appears again in a lesser-known register from 1654. Under donors to the Casa degli Umili, it's contributed 1 copper spoon, 4 candles, and a small pouch of ground sage. Why? No one knows. Perhaps it was gratitude, perhaps guilt, or perhaps it was her quiet way of writing her name back into the story. But one final entry gives us pause. In the Officio archive, on a faded page dated March 1657, someone scribbled in the margin beside her old file, Julia C., former debtor, married, died of fever, no children, file closed, cassettes, none. The state had finished with her, but we haven't, because in her story of tallies, borrowed service, and careful silence, we see the broader question: what happens to a society that learns to price its daughters by the quarter? In the years following the Great Plague, Milan tried to cleanse itself physically, spiritually, and economically. White lime was thrown across streets, churches were scrubbed with vinegar, public processions were banned, then reinstated, then banned again. But some things proved harder to wash away. One of them was a system that had turned orphan girls into financial instruments. By the late 1630s, the office for girls had grown in size. It now occupied 3 full rooms in the Palazzo della Ragione, with staff dedicated to assessments, correspondence, debt tallies, and disciplinary referrals. Girls were now classified by a tiered code system: A class, literate, compliant, skilled in needlework; B class, illiterate, but obedient; C class, morally at risk, a vague designation that often included orphans from outside the city. Proper D class, girls with illnesses, stutters, nightmares, or any history of misbehavior. The code followed them for life, even after discharge. The city retained the right to review their marriage choices, assign them service work, or recall them in cases of public need. A phrase so broad it could mean anything from textile shortages to a request for additional singers in a cathedral choir. A girl might leave the orphanage gates, but her file never left the shelves. In 1642, the Council of 10 Milan's chief civic authority commissioned a report on the system's effectiveness. The resulting document, called the Trattato di Rendimento Femminile, analyzed over 4,000 girl cases from the previous 50 years. The findings were never published, but surviving fragments show sobering conclusions. The girls, once trained, do serve the city's quiet needs, but their costs exceed their profit, except in cases of domestic sale, which are now discouraged due to ecclesiastical unease. The phrase domestic sale referred delicately to a practice that had emerged during the peak of the plague, selling girls as bonded servants to wealthy households outside Milan. In theory, this was voluntary. In practice, it was coerced, particularly when a girl was approaching 21, still in debt. In one preserved case from 1648, a girl named Teresa Benedetta, age 19, was told she could either serve 3 more years in the paper mill of Pry, San Zeno, or be placed with a household in Verona, where her debt would be absorbed. She chose the second. Her file includes a closing line: K. Inscribes handwriting. Exit approved. Moral risk low. Spoke well. Pretty fingers. Pretty fingers. That's what the state remembered about her. Others were not so fortunate. One girl, Annetta, refused all placements. She reportedly ran away 4 times and, when captured, screamed so violently that she was labeled spiritually inverted. The term was vague, but it disqualified her from adoption or marriage. She died of lung fever in 1651. Her record reads: acids at death, 1 rosary, 2 torn aprons, no redemption. There was no service held, no burial paid by the city. She was carted with others to a communal pit near the Maggiore hospital wall. Yet, for every Annetta, there was a girl like Camilla M., who, after her discharge, became a teacher in a poor parish school. She wrote carefully, beautifully. Her former orphans were taught to sew, to read, and when no priest was watching to sing, she refused payment. She wore brown cloth. She told no one of her past, but it leaked through in quiet ways. In a letter, dated 1659, one of her students wrote, "Our maestra never yells. She teaches by pointing and nodding. She prays softly when she thinks we are asleep. Once, she cried while threading a needle. We did not ask why. Camilla was never recorded in the council's formal accounts, Toda, but she left behind 27 letters, now housed in a private archive, where they sit unexamined in a box marked Miscellanea Feminal. Those letters hint at a question one the ledgers never asked. What did the girls dream about at night? We'll never know for sure. The ledgers didn't care, okay? They recorded growth, obedience, teeth, handwriting, but not grief, not longing. The dreams of a girl who stared through barred windows at the rooftop chimneys of Milan and imagined. Elsewhere, what remains today are the numbers. Casa degli Umili operated for 97 years. Over 9,000 girls passed through its doors. Fewer than 600 left with their debts officially cleared. Even fewer were buried with a name in the buildings. They're gone. The last orphan hall was demolished in the early 1800s to make room for military housing. A plaque once stood near the site, but was removed during urban renovations. No monument replaced it, but the paper trail survived quiet, great, folded in the archives. If you request the right boxes, and if your fingers don't tremble, you can still find them. The sheets stamped with candle wax, the margins filled with calculations, the names of girls turned into math. And in that silence, maybe you'll hear the whisper of a question not recorded but felt. How many children must be taxed before a city remembers they were once loved? Asterisk, in the year 1477, the city of Bruges bustled with trade. Bales of English wool arrived by boat. Rows of flax lay drying in the sun, and narrow, cobbled streets echoed with the chatter of merchants in Flemish, French, and Latin. The air smelled of damp stone, brewing hops, and the faint iron tank of tools newly forged, but beneath the rhythm of commerce. Another pattern quietly spread through the city, more silent than trade, more delicate than lace. It began with a decree, issued not by the Burgundian court, nor by any noble hand, but by the Guild of Custodians, powerful urban body responsible for moral oversight in the city's expanding merchant class. Their role, originally limited to market standards and business ethics, had grown in the wake of a scandal involving forged baptismal records and a string of unwed pregnancies among servant girls. In merchant households, the guild was determined to root out unmarked influences, and they decided to begin with hair. Their logic, archaic, even by their own standards, was built on 3 pillars. That long, thick hair signaled vanity and temptation. That a girl's braid, once loosed, could invite impropriety. That the act of grooming oneself without permission indicated a willful nature. These ideas were not new, but the hair registry of Bruges, as it came to be known, was girls between the ages of 9 and 16, regardless of class, were now required to appear at a municipal building near the central canal, where a guild matron would record the length of their hair in finger widths, its texture fine, coarse, wavy, limp, its color described with astonishing precision, candle brown, house light, whether it was bound in braid, coil, or left loose, and most strangely whether it showed signs of recent washing. All of this was logged into a bound book known as the Tress Register, which now sits in fragments inside the Bruges City Archives. Page after page of soft handwriting in oak gall ink, detailing the intimate appearances of children as if they were parcels of cloth or breeds of dog. Each girl's entry ended with a judgment: acceptable, needing reform, or to be observed. One of the earliest entries reads, March AV, age 11, braid length 22 fingers. Texture, glossy, too smooth. Wears it with pride. Marked, to be observed. To be observed was not a legal sentence, but it had consequences. Girls with that designation could be stopped by city monitors, uniformed. Boys, called Plakenjangensan, questioned about their behavior. They could be assigned to devotional activities under the local sisters of modesty. In some cases, their families were warned by letter that a second offense, appearing with an unpinned braid, could result in a temporary removal from home. They called it moral corrective separation. The girls called it being taken for hair. There were protests, but they were whispered. Many parents, especially mothers, had once themselves been entered into the registry. The practice spread quietly, house to house, school to school. Teachers were expected to inspect braids before morning prayer. Shopkeepers could report girls who touched their hair too often. Over time, entire streets became informally categorized by the registry. Red alleys, zones of high observation, usually where lace workers and soap vendors lived. Yellow alleys, mixed zones, under soft watch white alleys, mostly wealthy households. Granted informal exemptions since 1483. A new twist was introduced. Girls marked to be observed for more than 2 consecutive seasons were required to submit a physical sample of their braid to be stored. The guild matron would cut a 4-finger length of hair and tie it with waxed thread. The braid was then labeled and placed in a long drawer in the custodian's hall. Dozens of plaits stacked like dried herbs. These locks were believed to hold tendencies. Some custodians claimed they could detect a girl's character by sniffing the braid. Others said that if a girl's hair grew back too fast, she was racing toward rebellion. It sounds absurd now, but to those girls, it was real. Janikin M., age 13, was the first girl recorded as resisting the cut. Her story survives because her mother, a weaver with 3 daughters, wrote a letter of protest to the mayor, claiming the practice was shameful, humiliating, and made her child afraid to sleep. The letter is still kept in the Bruges archive, tucked between registry volumes. The official response reads simply, "Let the family be reminded that pride leads to ruin. The guild is merciful. The braid is not the girl." Janikin's braid was taken the following week. Asterisk. Girls began to tie their hair tighter. Some smeared it with flour to dull the shine. Others shaved their heads entirely. But this often triggered additional punishment. Abandonment of feminine virtue. A girl could not win. She could be too vain or too defiant, too clean or too indifferent. There were reports of girls exchanging braids, tricking the guild with false samples. But these stories mostly live in rumor. The records suggest quiet compliance, and when resistance did arise, it often ended in a visit to the Sisters of Modesty for retreats. These retreats were held in a former candle house outside the city gates. Girls stayed there for 3 to 6 weeks, learning to pin their hair with humility and pray before mirrors covered in linen. One former guild matron later confessed, in her retirement notes, the girls often did not understand. They asked why their hair mattered. I had no answer, but I feared for them more if no one watched. Girls become women, and women, if left unwatched, move like wind through cracks indoors. In the archives, several dozen braids remain, faded, brittle, tied with ancient thread. Some are labeled with names, others bear only dates. There's one, dark gold and nearly 2 feet long, labeled, removed for her own good, case closed. The girl's name is smudged away by age or intent, and so we're left with a simple question, not asked by the guild, but by history itself. When does observation become a kind of imprisonment? Asterisk. By 1487, the hair registry had grown into something larger than even its architects intended. It was no longer just a book of braids and names. It had become a shadow sensasa, quiet mirror of the city's daughters. And like all mirrors, It began to reflect the fears of those who gazed into it. At first, the registry was just a ledger, then a set of shelves, okay? But eventually, it required an entire wing in the custodian's hall. The drawers were labeled by season, winter 1484 to spring 1485, and so on. Each drawer held a box of sample sprays wrapped in wax paper, tied with thread, each tagged with the girl's initials and her assigned observation level. This wing became known as the bell floor, 'cause it sat just beneath the tower where the custodians rang the daily curfew bell, and on that bell floor, something strange began to happen. Clerks tasked with reviewing the registry began grouping girls into informal categories: stillness, compliant, silent, low threat, flutter, dreamy, prone to wandering, soft rebellion whirl, talkative, high emotion, likely to influence others break, direct defiance, or inversion of gaze. Meaning a girl who looked adult in the eye. These terms were never used publicly, but they were written in pencil in the margins of registry cards. And once assigned, they stuck. The girls didn't know their labels, but they felt them. Teachers, shopkeepers, and midwives began to treat the girls differently. A stillness girl might be chosen to assist at the altar. A world girl might be passed over for apprenticeships. These decisions weren't announced, they were understood. A web of soft exclusions based on silent judgments. This was the watch list, and it spread far beyond hair. One entry from summer 1486 reads, Clara J. 12. Braid returned shinier than first recorded. Marks of oil, observed smiling while crossing Fish Market alone. Labeled, whirl, watch level raised, smiling, alone. That was all it took to the custodians. Clara wasn't a person, she was a signal. As the registry expanded, so did its influence. By 1490, there were quiet policies in several Bruges guilds requiring all young female apprentices to present proof of their registry status. Girls without a tour marked flutter or whirl were often rejected. That same year, a group of lace merchants petitioned for a registry exemption for girls who wore their hair modestly and did not come from suspect streets. The exemption was denied, but it revealed the growing tension. Many merchants feared the registry was creeping beyond its stated purpose. They weren't wrong. Behind the guise of morality, the registry was slowly becoming an instrument of urban control, and it all still centered around hair. In winter, girls were expected to pin their braids tightly beneath woolen caps. But even the shape of the pin mattered. Rounded pins were seen as childish and modest. Ornate ones, especially those made of brass or carved bone, suggested vanity. A girl with a decorated pin could be called to the custodian's hall for a presentation review. That review often meant one thing: the braid was cut again, not just as punishment, but as correction. It was called leveling. The idea was that all girls should pass through at least one cut during their adolescence, a kind of moral pruning. Many mothers complied. Some even brought their daughters involuntarily, saying it was better to have it done now before someone else demands it. These visits were logged under family-initiated cuts. One log from May 1489 reads, Mother of Nellie V. requests early leveling. Says child smiles too freely and is lately sung while washing. Agrees to full braid cut. No resistance noted. All girls went quietly. Esme T., age 14, resisted her second cut. She reportedly shouted, kicked over the stool, and called the guild matron a rat with scissors. Her case was escalated. She was placed in observation retreat for 2 months. When she returned, her braid was gone, her voice quieter, but up. Week later, she was caught chalking a smiley face on a barrel. Her file was labeled break. She was never seen in public again. There were rumors, always rumors, that girls labeled break were sent to a house outside the city where they were taught to speak only in proverbs. that they were sometimes given permanent veils, that they were never allowed to grow their hair again. None of these are in the official records, okay? But in the Tres Register, beside Esme's final entry, someone penciled in a single word: gone. By the early 1490s, cracks began to form in the system. Several fathers refused to bring their daughters to the guild for remeasurement. One merchant, Peter van Noord, famously declared during a guild meeting, "My daughter's braid is not a confession. You may log my barrels, not my blood." He was fined, but his daughter, Lena, was not registered again. Shortly after, others began to push back. The Sisters of Modesty reported dwindling compliance. Haircuts slowed, okay? The bell floor clerks complained of missing appointments and uncooperative mothers. For a moment, it seemed the city might abandon the practice altogether. But just then, in 1492, a new guild matron was appointed, Agnes de Wolfe, severe woman known for her strict belief in physical signs of virtue. She revived the registry with new methods, her most controversial, the index of curl. This was a new metric that assessed not just length and cleanliness, but texture shape. Waves and curls were seen as unruly. Straight hair, modest and calm. In nature, girls with curls were labeled with a red mark. Some were required to bind their hair wet each night to retrain it. Others were required to confess weekly. A few girls tried to straighten their hair with ash paste and soap. Others wept as they brushed for hours, chasing a shape that never arrived in the guild's eyes. Control over the braid meant control over the girl. Yet, beneath the surface, resistance simmered. Girls began to draw small flowers on their braids, using chalk. They tied knots in secret places. They whispered registry numbers like curses, okay? And when the bell floor burned down in a mysterious fire in 1495, okay, many believed it was no accident. The city blamed faulty candle storage. But one record, buried in the municipal minutes, states, "Fire began near the braid drawers. Smell of wax and charred thread. Names destroyed, 413. 413 names erased. Perhaps that was the only freedom some girls ever got. Asterisk. And so we wonder, what does a society fear when it begins to catalog its daughters by their hair? Asterisk. By the turn of the 16th century, the Tres Register of Bruges had begun to fray both literally and figuratively. Pages curled from damp, the once crisp margins now softened with fingerprints, grease, and the fading ink of hundreds of little names. But more than the book itself, okay? It was the system that had started to come apart. The fire of 1495, which burned through the bell floor drawers, had charred nearly 400 entries, though many were rewritten from memory by cross-referencing secondary ledgers and parish logs. Subtle shift had occurred. The fear had begun to change direction. The girls were no longer just afraid of the registry. Now, the registry was afraid of being forgotten in the years following the fire. Fewer parents complied with the braid documentation process. Complaints of insubordination rose. Guild clerks began to request enforcement powers from the cities. Watchmen, hoping to penalize unregistered girls or those with unbound tendencies. The city, however, declined, formally stating in 1497 that, while the observance of modest grooming remains encouraged, the magistrates shall not impose arrest for follicular deviation. That meant no one would be jailed for their hair. It wasn't liberation, but it was enough of a turning point for the system to lose its grip. And then came the final shift. One not made in the guild halls, but in the alleys and bakeries and riverbank lanes where the girls walked. They began to speak again, not loudly, not defiantly, just freely. They started with ribbons. Ribbons had always been part of childhood, but now they took on new meanings. A ribbon tucked beneath a braid could signal you'd refused your second inspection. A red ribbon woven through a bun meant you had once been leveled and grown your braid back in defiance. Some girls wore 2 ribbons, though this was risky. It suggested you had slipped out of your observation retreat and returned unmarked. No record confirms any girl ever succeeded in doing this, but the rumor of it was enough to create a myth of escape. There were songs, 2 half-sung lullabies, passed from girl to girl in the dim, unlit hours after the bells had rung curfew. One refrain appears in several old notebooks. Tie it once for silence, tie it twice for sleep, but if you braid it backward, your mind you get to keep. These songs weren't open rebellion. They were cultural erosions, low, persistent, and uncontainable. Even the Sisters of Modesty began to notice. A report from Sister Wilhelmine, dated 1498, warns, the girls braid one another's hair now, even without permission. They do so in silence, but with care, as though the act itself were prayer. I fear they are finding comfort in each other, rather than in God. The Guild's final attempt to reclaim control came with the creation of the civic braid token. This was a small pin worn at the nape of the neck signifying that the girl had passed all observations and was aligned with city virtue. It was meant to replace the need for repeated inspections, but few girls wore it, and those who did were often teased. In a city where everyone knew the signs, the token became a symbol, not of virtue, but of compliance. One girl, Margaret E., reportedly dropped hers into the canal in front of 3 placangons. When asked why, she replied, "If I'm going to be watched, I'd rather not wear the leash." That same winter, the Guild of Custodians disbanded its female oversight wing. They claimed it was due to financial restructuring, but surviving letters tell another story. The Guild had lost its authority. Fewer families complied. Fewer schools reported infractions. The registry became, in essence, a ghost book updated in form, but ignored in practice. What happened to the remaining braids? Some were burned, some buried, some boxed away. A handful, perhaps 20 remain in the archives today, pressed into flat paper packets labeled historical threads, 15th century. One braid, long and black, is marked E. It may belong to Esme T., the defiant girl who shouted at the matron. Another, short and rough, is labeled only unknown, found after fire. But the last entry in the trust register is the most curious. It is dated the 1501. It reads, "No further entries. Observation no longer mandated. Girls now advised only. Braid measure suspended. Final note, girls continue to braid regardless." There, it is final and quiet. They continued to braid, even when no one demanded it, even when the scissors were gone, even when the books closed, because for many of them, the braid had changed meaning. It was no longer a symbol of obedience. It became an act of memory, a thread of connection, a simple daily ritual done in the mirror, in silence, in defiance. Today, tourists wander the streets of Bruges, admiring the canals and spires, unaware of the girls who once passed those same corners with their heads down, their hair tied tight, and their names entered in a ledger just for growing. The buildings have changed. The curls are gone, but in a quiet archive drawer, the braids remain, and we're left with one final thought. If hair could speak, what would it remember about being watched, about being measured, about being enough to worry a city? Asterisk, in the Castilian city of Valladolid, around the year 1609. The evening bell rang just after the last slice of sunlight slipped beneath the spires of the Iglesia de San Pablo. The streets quieted. Doors latched and shutters closed, not because of fear, but because of law, a very specific law, one that declared after the evening bell, no girl under 20 shall speak in public without permission or presence of a male guardian or a licensed spiritual monitor. It was called La Ley del Silencio Nocturno, the night silence law. It did not apply to men. it did not apply to married women. Again, it applied only to unmarried girls, beginning from age 7. Again, and it was enforced not with brutality, but with paper, inspections, and removal. The idea, like many restrictive policies, claimed to originate from virtue. A pamphlet circulated by the Royal Brotherhood for Modesty and Order explained the reasoning. Speech invites curiosity. Curiosity invites sin, and sin, once spoken aloud, spreads faster at night. There was a theological reasoning too. Darkness was considered the hour of Eve, of temptation, of saints tested, and demons heard. If a girl spoke too freely under moonlight, she might hear her own voice echoed back in dangerous ways, and so the rule became practice, and the practice became punishment. At first, it was simple. After the bell rang at sundown, girls walking through the plaza were expected to remain silent unless spoken to. Then, local friars added a clause. Silence must extend to alleyways, doorsteps, and public fountains. Soon after, private homes with open windows were added by 1611. The law had evolved again. Girls who sang, hummed, recited prayers aloud, or even whispered names could be charged with improper sonic conduct. The phrase may sound fictional, but it appears in dozens of handwritten incident reports, faded pages with names, times, offenses, and the phrase held until clarity of purpose is established. One of the earliest cases was Beatrice M., a 13-year-old whose mother sent her to fetch water from the city fountain just before nightfall. She walked quickly. She filled her pail. She softly recited a hymn on her way home. She was overheard by a member of the madrigadores, the city's nighttime compliance patrol. These men wore soft leather shoes and carried a silver badge. They were paid not for arrests, but for documentation. Beatriz was brought before the Council of Quiet, an administrative body formed specifically to review violations of the silence law. She was asked what hymn she had sung. She replied, Ave Maris Stella. They asked her why. She said, because the stars were coming out. They labeled her a romantic deviant. She was sent for correction at the House of Tempered Voice, a converted merchant home turned detention dormitory for sons and daughters of excessive tone. Her stay lasted 42 days. She returned home thin, quiet, and reluctant to speak after sunset ever again. No bruises, says quiet. The law's genius was in its gentleness. It did not whip or brand. It measured, recorded, and calmly insisted. Records show hundreds of entries like Beatrice's, spoke the name of her sister after the 8th bell, asked for a fig in the plaza after the sun had set, sang to a doll near the bread ovens after hours, whistled to herself in a garden, laughed at the moon. Each act earned a citation. 3 citations earned you a hearing, and if, during the hearing, you attempted to defend yourself too confidently, you might be marked a mere voice, a terramere voice, used to describe girls who reflected back what they heard too eagerly. In other words, girls who had opinions, who mimicked adults, or who used clever language. Girls with mirror voices were considered socially risky by 1615. Valladolid's silence law had influenced nearby towns, Palencia, Zamora, and parts of Salamanca. Similar policies were adopted, though often softened. But only in Valladolid did the law take root with such strange intensity, because in Valladolid, enforcement came not just from the council, but from neighbors. A public campaign called Voices Go Further Than Feet encouraged residents to report afterward speech. If you heard a girl talking on the other side of a wall, you were expected to report it to the Oficina de Cama. In return, you might receive a reduction on your bread levy. The law became economically useful, and so, even those who disagreed with it often participated. A merchant's wife who needed tax relief might report a girl humming while shelling beans. A baker's assistant might trade a whispered accusation for a chance at an apprenticeship. The night was no longer just dark, it was listening. Not every girl was caught. Many whispered carefully, invented new ways to signal each other. They tapped walls, used hand gestures. Some sang into barrels or down wells, just to hear their voices return without being heard by anyone else. But the fear persisted in the house of tempered voice. Entries described the daily routines: morning prayer, whispered catechism, silent meals, once a week. The girls were permitted to speak, but only using approved phrases from a list of 88 sentences. Among them, "May I offer my silence in service of peace? I wait in grace, not in voice. I have spoken enough for one lifetime." Any unapproved sentence resulted in what the wardens called reflection ayr, form of solitary sitting. Facing the corner with one's hands folded in mouth, covered by a linen cloth. These punishments were not cruel in the traditional sense, but they were designed to linger. One girl, Lucia F., wrote years later in a confession now preserved in a monastery archive: "After they made me sit in the corner for 7 nights, I began to forget what my own laugh sounded like. When I heard it again accidentally, I didn't recognize it. It frightened me." So we return to the idea: what is silence when it is chosen? And what is silence when it is given as a sentence? In Valladolid, no one outlawed music. No one silenced men. The bells still rang. The fountains still gurgled. The city still moved. But the girls, they whispered in the presence of stars and called that safety, because they knew long before it was written down that a law does not need to be loud to be heard. Asterisk. If you walk past the house of tempered voice during the winter of 1616, you might have heard the creak of its iron hinges. You might have seen the narrow courtyard through a slit in the wall. You would not have heard laughter or conversation or the murmur of girls passing the time. That was the point. The building sat just off Calle del Silencio, a side street so narrow it swallowed sound. Its windows were small and high, barred with rusted iron painted over in whitewash. The exterior looked like a former granary, and it once was before it was purchased by the Royal Brotherhood for modesty and order, and retrofitted into a spiritual dwelling of quiet correction. It housed between 30 and 50 girls at a time, ages usually between 9 and 17. Stay duration: 1 month for first offenders, up to 6 for repeated speech violations. Offenses ranged from late hour echoing to unauthorized wordplay. Everything inside the house was constructed to mute. Walls were double-thick adobe. Floors were sanded daily to absorb footsteps. Doors were padded with goat hide. Even the chairs, if they could be called, that had no legs, only floor mats. There were no clocks, but the day moved in fixed units. The bells of San Benito could be heard faintly at key hours, though the girls weren't allowed to refer to them. Instead, they were taught to tell time by shadow markers, thin lines drawn on the wall with charcoal. Each line marked a shift: morning instruction, midday reflection, evening fasting. Speech was allowed for 30 minutes each Friday morning, but only using phrases selected from a book called El Compos del Silencio, the Compass of Silence. The book contained 88 sanctioned sentences, 42 permitted questions, 15 phrases of apology, and 1 warning. Printed on the inside cover: "To speak without measure is to invite decay." Each girl had to memorize 40 of these phrases before discharge. The instructors tested them weekly. One girl, Catalina S., who had been caught reciting a poem to her younger sister beneath a fig tree, wrote her own version of the compass while in confinement. In it, she twisted the authorized phrases into poetry. "I wait in grace, not in voice," became "My voice waits in a cage where the sun does not knock." Her personal writings, later discovered under the loose floorboard of a storage room, scripts now survive in the Archivo Histórico Provincial de Valladolid. Scholars today call it the first poetic defiance of the silence law, but she never got to finish it. Catalina was held for 92 days. On the 73rd, she was caught humming a lullaby, no lyrics. As punishment, her 30-minute speech privileges were revoked for the remainder of her stay. Her final writing ends mid-line, "When the fig tree sleeps, She was released without further incident. But when interviewed decades later by a traveling Jesuit, she reportedly whispered, "I still avoid dusk. I fear the words may come out." Not all girls were punished harshly. Many simply fell quiet and followed the rhythm. A few seemed to embrace it, finding comfort in the rules, in the slow stillness. These were referred to by the wardens as drifters' girls, who adapted so completely that speech became unnecessary. One such girl, Maria de Los Angeles T., was reportedly so obedient that she was made an assistant warden at just 16. She later married into a clerical family and helped develop the updated guide for daughters of reserve, a companion manual for teaching girls to remain silent even in marriage. Her writings reflect a kind of soft loyalty to the system. The voice is like water, spilled too much, and the ground forgets what was said. Best to keep it in a jar. But this was not the majority experience. Most girls arrived frightened. Many cried, silently, in their bedrolls. The older girls helped the younger ones communicate without breaking rules. They tapped knuckles, mimed the shapes of words, held fingers over their lips, and pointed at the moon. These soft gestures became a hidden language, passed from girl to girl. It was never documented by the wardens. That was its strength. One surviving letter, smuggled out by a laundress, reads, "We talk with wrists. We blink in threes. When it is safe, we smile sideways. They think we are quiet, but we are only waiting." Outside the house, enforcement continued. The madrugadores, the nighttime patrol, grew more vigilant. By 1617, they carried small notebooks and wrote citations using abbreviated codes. PVF, public voice, after. Fading sunset, WHPS, whisper. Heard, possible song, NTNN, named Name at Night, Susla, suspected laughter, Aliich, entry required 2 witnesses. But as with all policies built on fear, the rules began to bend. Neighbors could be coerced, witnesses could be invented. And so, the law meant to preserve, virtue created a culture of soft betrayal. Even girls inside the house of tempered voice were sometimes reported by other inmates, hoping to shorten their stay. The wardens encouraged this, offering extra food or earlier bedtime in exchange for information. Some resisted this pressure. One record tells of Isabel, age 15, who refused to name a fellow girl caught mouthing a story during embroidery hour. Isabel was denied meals for 3 days. When asked again, she replied, "I heard only a story meant for the moon. It is not mine to repeat." Her act of quiet defiance made her a legend. Girls carved her initials I onto the wooden beams of the sleeping room. Several of these carvings remain today, faint but visible. So, what was the true cost of the silence law? It wasn't only time or restriction. It wasn't even the forced stillness. It was the idea that a girl's voice was an asset to be rationed, that her thoughts were suspect unless spoken under supervision. Saying a sister's name after sunset could mark you for reform, even after the law began to fade informally. Slowly, like a curtain easing shut, it lingered in memory. Many of the girls grew up into women who still feared dusk. Mothers who whispered bedtime stories behind drawn curtains. Grandmothers who told their granddaughters to save their voice for the right time, never saying when that would be. And today, if you walk down Calle del Silencio, there's no sin marking the house of tempered voice. It was turned into a bakery in the 1700s, then a wine cellar. Now it is a boutique where tourists try on scarves and sip cold coffee. No one remembers the law, but the silence still clings to the stones. Asterisk by 1623. The silence law of Valladolid had begun to unravel, not through decree, but through the quiet refusal of girls to remain as silent as the city demanded. The bell still rang each evening, its echo bouncing through the tight stone alleys, reminding everyone that the hour of quiet had come. But now, the echoes were being answered, sometimes softly, sometimes with words, and sometimes with music. The first formal challenge came not from a noble or priest, but from a girl with a harp. Her name was Inés del Campo, age 16, a servant in the household of Don Cristobal Ortega, a wealthy bookseller known for importing works of quiet, subversion translations of Erasmus and other writers, who gently questioned the rules of obedience. Inés had been born under the silence law. She knew nothing else. Her earliest memories were of being hushed, of being told that questions were for morning, not dusk. But her hands had always been restless, and in the Ortega household, she found an old harp missing 2 strings and began to teach herself by ear. One evening, after returning from market, she sat on the back steps and played a tune she had heard in the street, a lullaby from a visiting Portuguese cloth merchant. She did not sing, she did not speak, but the sound, soft, hesitant, beautiful, rose into the air just after the evening. Bella, neighbor reported her. The madrigadores arrived within the hour. She was not taken to the house of tempered voice. She was taken to La Casilla, a stone holding cell typically used for petty theft or minor market offenses. There, she waited 2 nights while the Council of Quiet debated her case. The question was new. Was instrumental sound considered speech? Some argued, yes. After all, sound, especially at night, could stir emotion, awaken memory, excite disobedience. But Don Cristobal, her employer, came to her defense. He quoted from the Vulgate, from civic charters, even from the Brotherhood's own pamphlets. Nowhere, he said, did the law ban melody without words, and, more importantly, Inés had played with no audience, no intent to provoke. His arguments reached the ears of 2 council members sympathetic to reform. Inés was released. No charges were recorded, but the event changed everything. The very next week, 3 more girls played music after the bell. 2 on reed flutes, 1 tapping rhythms on a wooden table. Within a month, the city recorded 11 new musical violations, all committed by girls under 20. The council was alarmed. They called it unauthorized resonance. A new pamphlet was circulated, warning that melody, even without tongue, loosens the soul and disrespects the stillness due to God and city. Yet the girls continued, and not just with instruments. They began to whisper poems. 2 leave chalk marks on walls, short, careful verses. The bell is not my keeper. Words are not crimes. Dusk is not a door that closes my mouth. Wardens at the House of Tempered Voice were overwhelmed. Records show their capacity reached 94 girls by late spring 1624. They asked for more beds, more cloths, more ledgers. But even with increased intake, the behavior spread. This wasn't a rebellion of fire and noise. It was a rebellion of rhythm. In late summer of that year, a group of girls began gathering near the bridge of Olmedo, just outside city bounds. It was technically beyond the reach of the law. At dusk, they would sit in a circle and speak not loudly, but clearly. A tale, stories. They recited old verses. Some recounted the questions they had never been allowed to ask aloud. One story survives from these gatherings, the tale of Maria de la Fuente, a girl who had once spoken her brother's name after sunset and being held for echoing in vain. After her release, she returned each evening to the river and spoke that name again once, softly, without regret. Her story was passed from girl to girl. In her name, others began to test the edge of curfew. By 1625, the silence law was faltering, not because the council had changed it, because the people stopped listening. Parents stopped reporting. Teachers stopped enforcing. Some priests refused to file voice infractions, claiming they had heard no sin in a girl's whisper. Even the madrigadors began to look the other way. But the final blow came from an unexpected source. The bell itself, the curfew bell of San Benito, which had rung every evening for nearly 30 years, cracked on a damp autumn night in 1626. No storm, no earthquake, no vandalism, just a split, clean and sudden, silencing it mid-ring. It was never repaired. The city claimed the funds were needed elsewhere, but people whispered that the bell had grown tired of commanding silence. No one obeyed. The Council of Quiet never issued a retraction of the silence law. Instead, it simply stopped meeting. Their minutes end with a final line and faded. Ink. Voices now beyond measure. We surrender to dusk. The House of Tempered Voice closed within 2 years. Its final ledger lists only 9 girls. The building stood empty for decades. Eventually, it became a storage hall for barley. The girls moved on. They grew, married, migrated. Many forgot the exact words of their rebellion, but not the feeling. And today, there is no plaque on Calle del Silencio, no monument for the law or its quiet fall. But if you visit the old stones of San Benito, you might find, just beneath the bell tower, near the archway, a line carved in the wall, almost hidden. We were only ever asking to say our names out loud. And maybe that's the question we should still ask. What kind of law fears a girl saying her own name? Asterisk in the alleys of Florence, just after the turn of the 15th century. The scent of parchment and powdered ink hung in the air like fine dust. Booksellers shouted prices beneath hanging awnings. Scribes hunched over long desks behind shaded windows. And boys, always boys, were taught to dip quills into ink without shaking their hands. But the girls were taught to keep their hands clean, because in Florence, around 1402, a quiet rule was whispered through the city's guild halls and convent doors. A girl with ink-stained fingers is one question away from danger. This wasn't a lot, at least not at first. There was no official edict, no signature from the Signoria, Tia, but it spread faster than a decree. It's like moisture on old paper. The origins of the ink ban, as it came to be known, traced back to a small incident involving a girl named Grazia di Neri, the 12-year-old daughter of a parchment cutter. Her father, having lost 2 sons, too fevered, decided to teach Grazia to read the names of clients, tally orders, and record the widths of goat vellum. She proved fast, too fast. Within months, she had begun practicing marginalia, those decorative side notes scribes often drew around illuminated texts. She was caught, not by her father, but by a Dominican brother, making a delivery from San Marco. He saw her copying a discret depose. He saw her copying a line from a devotional book and reported her. The line, even the smallest hand may hold a sentence that troubles the powerful. Grazia was summoned to a local parish tribunal, not for her words, but for her access to ink. The ink itself became the focus. Ink was sacred. Ink was clerical. Ink was political. Ink was political. Ink was male. In a city where Medici money-funded scriptoria and libraries were guarded like chapels, the idea of a girl touching ink unsupervised was met with suspicion, not because of what she might copy, but what she might create. Soon after, Gracia's hearing, where no formal punishment was issued, but her father's business lost 3 major client city workshops, began to quietly restrict ink access for girls. Stationers posted small signs: nitrogen monoxide ink to unchaperoned females. Parish schools changed their curriculum. Reading remained, but writing was discouraged. Girls were allowed to trace letters in ash, water, or soft chalk, but not ink, not iron gall, not carbon black dot. The fear, as explained in a surviving memo from the Arte de Judici e Notai Guild of Judges and Notaries, was this: the written word, when passed through the soft hand of a girl, may lose its structure and invite fancy. In other words, girls might invent. An invention, in the eyes of the city's power, was disorder. Ironically, fear grew strongest among those who trafficked in ideas. Monks, legal clerks, merchants, they understood what ink could do. And they knew that one sentence written with care could outlive its author by centuries, so they moved quickly. Several convents once, quiet centers of female education, were asked to turn over their ink supplies. Some did. Others resisted. One abbess, Sister Benedetta del Sasso, famously replied to the courier with a note written in bold, brown ink: "We may surrender our voices, but not our verbs." Her convent was later denied grain shipments for 3 consecutive months. By 1405, the ban had grown into an unwritten but widely enforced civic standard. Girls were no longer taught how to sharpen quills. They could not purchase styluses, and, in some parishes, they were required to rinse their hands before entering churches, so as not to carry ink of secular purpose. And yet, as always, the rules only pushed the practice underground, in kitchens and laundries. Older girls began using wine sediment to write on cloth scraps. Some pressed flowers into pulp and wrote with the juice. Others stole bits of candle soot mixed with water and egg white to create crude but usable black. These improvised inks were called blushes, part joke, part secret. Girls would say, "She's been blushing on cloth again," meaning she's writing. One such girl, Lucetta F., the daughter of a tavern owner, became known for her apron poems. She would stitch verses into the seams of aprons worn by washerwomen. These poems were short, careful, and often anonymous. One fragment survives, found in the hem of a linen rag discovered in a well during 19th century excavation. "My fingers are clean, but they remember black. What I cannot write, I whisper to thread." Lucetta's verses were never published, but they passed hand to hand. And with each hidden line, the ink ban frayed. Yet the pressure remained, and guild houses' punishments became more creative. Fathers who permitted their daughters to write were denied access to watermark stamps, without which they couldn't sell official documents. Mothers who taught their girls to hold quills were publicly corrected by parish clerics during Mass, and still more girls learned. More fingers brushed ink. More verses appeared in margins, etched with sewing needles, burned faintly into bark, written backwards between the threads of drying linen. The band was a wall, but girls were wind. And so, we pause on this first section, not with an ending, but with a question. What happens when a society tries to erase a girl's hand from the sentence, only to find she has already written in the folds of its cloth? Asterisk. By 1407, 5 years after Grazia D. Neri was quietly punished for copying a sentence in her father's parchment shop. The ink ban had woven itself into Florentine life like a thread through cloth and written, but everywhere but unlike a wall or a gate. This ban had no sharp edge, crept instead through expectation, through what was taught and what was not, what was praised and what was quietly withdrawn. And so, many girls in Florence were not told, "You may not write." They were simply never shown how in elite homes. Girls were praised for embroidery, for singing psalms, for reciting prayers. Some even learned to redive, only to follow along with scripture or recognize their names in the marriage documents that would one day be handed to them. But writing was called a necessity for men, a temptation for women. The Arte dei Mercatanti, Florence's influential merchant guild, issued guidelines for household tutors. In them, one finds this line: Girls may be taught letters, but not arrangement. Names, but not opinions. Arrangement referred to composition, the act of forming sentences, of choosing what to say. It was feared that once a girl could shape a sentence, she might shape an idea. And if she could shape an idea, she might pass it on. And so girls adapted. They wrote in secret, not in books or unofficial parchment, but in margins, hymns, soapstone tiles, the underside of bread papers, the wooden slats beneath stools, and most ingeniously, in textiles using thread to record what ink could not. This gave rise to a hidden practice known in whispers as el punto leto, the reading stitch. Girls who had learned the alphabet from their brothers or from sympathetic nuns began to stitch letters into household linens, small, thin, tucked near the edges. Not monograms, not initials, sentences. Some were prayers, others memories. Some stitched lines they'd only ever heard once, echoes of conversations, not meant for them. One surviving example, preserved in the corner of a tattered pillowcase in a Florentine museum, reads, "The ink is for them, but the thread remembers." These weren't meant to be bold. They were meant to exist, to remind the hands that sewed and the eyes that glimpsed them that a girl could think and that thought had weight. One of the most famous examples of this resistance comes from a young servant named Giovanna degli Angeli, who worked in the household of a notary in Oltrano, the artisan-heavy district across the Arno River. Giovanna was never formally taught to write. She listened. Each day, she swept the office floor where legal letters and city decrees were copied by candlelight. Over time, she began memorizing the loops and swirls of Latin phrases. Then, using kitchen charcoal and the dull edge of a spoon, she traced the words into the flour-dusted surface of the baking table before wiping it clean. Later, she began stitching fragments of these sentences into drying cloths. Legal phrases sewn in rough thread beside fruit stains and soap streaks. The sentences made no legal sense. They were echoes, not copies, but they proved to something essential, that she saw the words, and that they stayed. One day, a cloth she had embroidered with the phrase "Fermo, nang fermo," and "Cora, fermo, I sign, I don't sign." Still, I sign was found by the notary's wife. Giovanna was dismissed the next morning. Her fate is unknown, but the cloth survived. The notary's apprentice kept it, perhaps moved by its defiance. It was found years later in the lining of a chest filled with legal ledgers. As the ink ban matured, so too did its contradictions. The Medici court famously, patrons of knowledge, employed dozens of male scribes and translators, but quietly discouraged education among its daughters beyond recitation and painting. The convent of Santa Maria degli Angeli, once a small haven for literate nuns, had its scriptorium shuttered in 1411, following a review by the Office of Civic Morality. The reason? Unclear need for feminine script. But even there, the resistance continued in a single surviving book of Psalms from the convent. Now held in Florence's Biblioteca Ricardiana, a faint marginal note, clearly penned by a woman, reads, "No one taught me. I learned from silence." One especially poetic form of rebellion came from the textile apprentices of Via dei Tessitori. The Weaver Street dot girls, working in linen workshops, developed a system of thread coda sequence, of stitch lengths and thread colors used to embed letters inside hem patterns. With enough skill, a sentence could run along the inner edge of a sheet, unnoticed unless unwoven. One fragment, decoded by modern historians, translates to, "Let the thread speak where the ink is watched." Another, longer and more ambitious, was stitched into the lining of a mourning veil. "This black is not for the dead. It is for what I am not allowed to say." The creator of that veil is unknown, but the veil itself was purchased by a noblewoman who wore it to mass for nearly 20 years. And what of the girls who didn't stitch? Some whispered to walls. Okay. Some wrote in air, using their fingers. Some watched the boys in the street, memorizing letter shapes from slate boards. And some did nothing but remembered. Remembered is the feeling of being told that thought belonged to someone else. And maybe that is why, even as the century turned, the ink-stained fingers kept appearing. By 1420, merchants began to complain of missing supplies, quills vanished, ink pots gone dry faster than expected. These complaints were dismissed. Between the lines, we read a different story. Girls were writing again, maybe not in ledgers, maybe not in books, but certainly in thread, in memory, in whatever space they could claim. And the men who feared it, they sensed it, too. They began to whisper of a flood of ink rising where none had been poured, because it had been sown, because it had been memorized, because it had never stopped. So we pause again with the softest of questions. What is ink, if not a tool? And what is fear, if it fears the smallest hand holding it? It's asterisk. By 1426, the ink ban in Florence no longer needed to be enforced. It had done what all soft restrictions hoped to do. It had written itself into custom, into habit, into the quiet shrug of a tutor saying, "It's not necessary for her." But even so, girls kept writing. They wrote without being taught. They wrote in chalk, in thread, in soot, in soap, in steam. And occasionally, very rarely but unforgettably, they wrote in ink. One of those rare events happened in the workshop of a papermaker named Ser Filippo di Martino on the eastern edge of the city, not far from the gates of Santa Croce. Ser Filippo had no children, but he employed 2 teenage boys and a girl named Nencia, the orphaned niece of his late wife. Nencia was small, sharp-eyed, quiet. She helped prepare pulp, hang drying sheets, and bind folios with linen string. She did not speak much, but she watched. And one afternoon, while the apprentices delivered fresh sheets to the notary's guild, Nencia sat alone in the binding room. She took a trimmed sheet of cotton paper, dipped a discarded quill in the black ink left behind by the journeyman, and wrote a sentence, just one, in her own hand. "This is mine. You did not give it to me." She folded the paper and tucked it between the inner covers of a folio marked for legal delivery. No one suspected that folio was delivered 3 days later to the Palazzo del Podesta, the city's judicial offices. And 3 weeks after that, during a routine ledger review, the sentence was found. There was no name, no signature. But the sentence was clear, defiant, unapologetic. The reaction was swift. The notary who received the volume demanded an inquiry. Guild scribes were questioned. Apprentices were inspected. Ink logs were reviewed, cleaned, but no source was found. The paper bore a watermark traced to Ser Filippo's shop. He was summoned, searched, questioned. He denied involvement and pointed out, truthfully, that his ink was freely accessible, though only to his male workers. Nencia was never mentioned, not by him, not by anyone, but her sentence had already. Traveled, a city official, perhaps moved by the elegance of the handwriting or the impossibility of its existence, did not burn the paper. He placed it into a drawer marked Miscellanea. Years later, it was catalogued. Today, it resides in a velvet folder inside the Archivio di Stato, differenza, labeled simply Anonymous C, 1426, feminine hand. It remains the only known surviving inked sentence, written by an unnamed Carol during the active years of the ink ban. Meanwhile, back in the city, strange thing began to happen. A new generation of mothers, many of whom had stitched thread poems or drawn letters in chalk, began asking softly but persistently that their daughters be taught to write, not publicly, not grandly, but quietly, at home, in corners, with the shutters closed by 1430. At least 4 parish schools in Florence were known to allow girls to practice writing. They called it ornamental literacy. The idea was that girls could write phrases from psalms or popular prayers. Nothing controversial, nothing original, but it was writing nonetheless. A merchant's wife, Lisabetta de Girolami, kept a journal in secret. In it, she recorded the first letters traced by her daughter, Agata. She wrote her name with 2 backwards letters. She laughed. It felt louder than bells. These small journals multiplied. Women traded them at market. Recipes scribbled on the back of linen lists. Household prayers passed from hand to hand. Some included lines in Latin, copied clumsily from their husbands' books. One line appears in several of these fragments. Scriptum est etiam in tenebris. It is written, even in darkness. Still, not everyone welcomed the change. The Arts de Judici Enotai issued a warning in 1432, cautioning against unauthorized script in domestic hands. It wasn't illegal, but it was discouraged. Paper sellers were told to report suspicious purchases. Ink sellers were warned not to supply women unaccompanied. But something had already shifted. The fear was no longer effective. 2. Many daughters had watched their mothers right behind curtains. Too many grandmothers had confessed, near death, that they had once written a line in ash or berry juice. The knowledge had survived, not in books, but in memory, repetition, and whispered instruction. By 1440, the ink ban had become a relic still spoken of, still unofficially observed in certain households, but largely ignored. No punishment was recorded after that year. No charges. No citations. Instead, we find more and more fragments, pages tucked inside recipe books, margins filled with names, prayers, and questions. One small ledger, belonging to a cloth dyer's daughter named Teresa B., ends with this. They said, we had nothing to write, but the world pressed on our fingers, and the ink came anyway. Ink ban never formally ended. There was no decree of repeal. But the city moved on. The girls, quietly and patiently, outlived the silence. Today, when we hold the pages of Florentine archives, we see neat legal hands, precise guild records, letters from merchants, orders from rulers. But sometimes, rarely, we find a note in a rounder, slower, more deliberate script, often in the margins, sometimes upside down, occasionally sewn into the edge of a page. They are not loud, they are not angry. They are simply present, proof that the girls kept writing long after they were told not to. Asterisk. In the old quarter of Krakow, sometime between Ilo Yiling and Itenlil by Arshawu, a peculiar practice settled into place beneath the roofs of boarding houses, parish orphanages, and modest girls' schools. It was known as Nagna Rejestraja Okawa, the nightly bed registration. At first, it was just a check. A lantern passed down a hallway, a nun or warden counting heads, a matron marking names in a worn notebook before the oil burned out. But as the city grew, and as fears about vagrancy, immorality, and wandering thoughts spread with whispers more persistent than any sermon, the nightly bed check evolved into something far more structured and far more strange. By 1613, tens of institutions across Krakow conducted the checks every night at exactly 1 hour after sunset, and these were no longer informal. The process had become municipally recorded. With girls as young as 6, listed each evening on parchment rolls sent weekly to a central office of domestic integrity, a civic body established just for this purpose. The logic was simple. If unsettling, a girl not found in her bed is a girl found in temptation. The assumption, girls who stayed in their rooms, tucked in, silent, motionless, could be trusted. Those whose bedding was rumpled, whose latch wasn't drawn, whose names weren't answered with present during the check could not. It began in orphanages and grew to include trade schools, embroidery houses, and even charitable boarding rooms for war widows' daughters. In each case, the same tools were used. A wooden tag hung at the end of each bed with the girl's name and a set of notches, a latch stamp, pressed into wax on the inside of the room's door before sundown, and a linen sheet marked at the corners with colored thread to denote inspection status at the appointed time. A warden would walk the hall with a tin lantern and a hooked staff, tapping the door frames once. Girls were to sit up, fold their hands, and say their name clearly. The warden checked for presence, bed stillness, sheet position, latch seal integrity. Each was marked on a form. Each form was filed. Every Saturday, the files were delivered to the Office of Domestic Integrity for review. Why such diligence? Because according to the doctrines promoted by Krakow as more severe religious leaders at the time, devil-moved and nighthand girls, in particular, were considered vulnerable to whispers through walls, through dreams, through open doors. Even a cracked window, it was believed, might invite thoughts improper for youth. One pamphlet, distributed by a group of laywomen affiliated with the Confraternity of Saint Sophia, stated, "A maiden's soul is light and may float to ruin if not tethered to her linens." And so, bad checks. At first, there were few consequences for failure. A missing bad check might result in a stern talk, an extra prayer. But by 1615, the checks were tied to a girl's right to leave the building during the day. Miss a bed checker. Have 2 unsettled nights in a row in your name was moved from Category I, free movement, to Category II, restricted path. Meaning, you could only go to assigned places and only under supervision. 3 offenses placed your name into Category 3 contained. Category 3 girls were denied exit for 7 days. They were watched more closely during meals. They were forbidden from handling sharp sewing tools or lit candles. Some were assigned to reflection corners, seated for hours beside iron-barred windows to restore internal stillness. No girl was ever formally accused of wrongdoing. No trial, no charge. It's just a sequence of checkboxes in a logbook. And still, lives changed. Take the case of Clara P., age 14, who lived in a boarding house attached to a tailor's guild. Her name appears repeatedly in the monthly roll of disrupted sleep kept by the Office of Domestic Integrity. Not because she wondered, but because her bed was often too warm. The report reads, "Bedding radiates heat inconsistent with idle rest. Suspected pre-check pacing." Clara's category was downgraded twice. She was denied a position in the journeyman tailoring program. Her file, rediscovered centuries later in the Jagiellonian library, includes a faded note from a supervisor. Tends toward night thought. May prove unsuitable for public commerce. All because her sheets held warmth. Another girl, Magdalena S., was found with a door latch that had not held its wax. The inspector noted it was likely due to heat and humidity. Still, she was sent to Dom Uspakagenia, the house of soothing where girls were taught calming behaviors. She stayed there for 19 days. Her only documented statement upon return, "I dreamed more carefully now." The city defended the practice as protective. Posters in market squares read, "Sleep is the first step toward purity. Let no daughter go unwatched." Some parents believed this. They felt safer knowing someone was counting the breaths of their children at night. Others remained silent. Resistance, after all, could be recorded. And in a city where your daughter's marriage eligibility might one day be reviewed alongside her bed check compliance index. Few dared question the logic. Even some girls began to internalize it. A school journal from 1618, founded Schwa Macchiani, includes a girl's list of self-reminders. Do not toss. It may crease the record. Say your name softly, but not lazily. Pray before sleeping, not during. Check. Do not forget to breathe like a folded napkin. That last line haunts the margins. And yet, as always, the more detailed the system, the more likely its cracks. Some girls began to trade names, answering present for one another in low voices when bed check approached. Others used heated stones from the laundry to warm their sheets in advance. A few learned to reseal wax latches using candle stubs and borrowed signet stamps. These small acts became legends. One name, Zoja M, appears in multiple false check reports. She was eventually confined for calculated stillness. Yet, a note in the same file, written in a different hand, reads, "She taught 6 girls to breathe like monks." Their names have not appeared on the roll since. And so, the bed check became a strange kind of theater, a ritual of blankets and silence, a nightly performance for the sake of paper. But what does paper know of sleep? What does a ledger know of dreams? We end this first section with a thought scribbled by an unknown hand on the back of a discarded check sheet. Discovered, folded into the cover of a hymn book. They counted me again. They saw my shape, but not my mind. I have learned to sleep with my eyes open. By the winter of 1620, the nightly bed check had become so systematized that the Office of Domestic Integrity could claim to predict a girl's behavior based on her sleep posture alone, not metaphorically literally. A revised inspection form, issued that year, added 4 new categories. SP, standard position, lying flat, hands folded, eyes closed, eye to idle tension, curled slightly, hands together or under cheek RM, restless motion, visible, shifting, or limb displacement. SD, sign of defiance, propped up, open, or blanket absent. Each was scored from 1 to 5. Cumulative weekly scores were tallied into Girls' Behavioral Stability Index, BSI. A score below 18 resulted in temporary social suspension. The purpose of this scoring system, according to official notes, was to encourage interior alignment with the stillness of the city. In practice, it meant that if a girl's posture seemed too alert or too relaxed, she might be considered unstable. The absurdity didn't register to the administrators. Their charts were tidy. Their scoring rubrics used straight edges and rulers. They believed in pattern, not people, but behind the pattern, something very human was happening. Girls began to train their bodies to sleep in certain positions, not for comfort, but for compliance. One girl, Agnieszka C., age 13, practiced lying perfectly flat on a wooden floor for 1 hour each day. Her supervisor praised her for maintaining unwavering physical discipline. She later confessed in a note hidden inside a pillow, "I have stopped dreaming. I fear it may crease my hands." Another girl, Hanka, used thread to tie her wrists together at night, not tightly, just enough to ensure her hands stayed folded. She left the thread visible so the inspector would see her dedication. This tactic worked for months, till a new warden saw it as premeditated control behavior and flagged her for unnatural submission tendencies. She was placed under review and denied outside access for 10 days. By now, inspections were not just about sleep. They had become about trustworthiness. A girl who passed her bed check every night for 30 consecutive days was marked a firm disposition. She could be recommended for early apprenticeship. She could be selected as a dormitory monitor. She might even be given unsupervised hour privileges. But failure even once could undo months of compliance. This is documented in the case of Renata M., 16-year-old lace worker's apprentice, who had earned 89 consecutive check marks. One night, She sat up to comfort a younger girl who was coughing. She missed the lantern's arrival by less than a minute. The report read, absent from posture, alert, mouth open, classification downgraded. Renata pleaded for her record to be restored. Her dormitory peers signed a letter in her defense. Taint, writing, vigilance, even when kind, disrupts order. Renata's privileges were revoked. She was reassigned to weaving. Her lacework had once been considered flawless. Despite these pressures, assistants continued quietly, cleverly, constantly. Some girls learned to simulate standard position using weighted dummy straw-stuffed blouses and bundled cloaks shaped beneath the covers. This method, known as the double, was used to sneak into adjoining rooms for whispered conversations or unsupervised prayers. The earliest known record of the double appears in a confiscated notebook from Maria W., a cobbler's daughter. The page included hand-drawn instructions, shaped torso, from wool wrap used bootlaces to bind arms at side draped blanket with false shoulders lie beneath spare sheet. In opposite corner Maria's notebook was burned, but a clerk copied excerpts before disposal. He noted, unironically, the girl shows excessive imagination, unfit for domestic roles. She was transferred to a wool facility outside Tarnot. Her subsequent records disappeared. Other girls took a different approach. They disrupted the forms themselves. A series of forged bed check rolls began circulating between institutions. Some were altered to hide missing girls. Others replaced low scores with higher ones. A few simply added new names to the roster's ghost girls, invented to confuse the system. One such ghost, Elspeta T., appeared in 5 different institutions between 1621 and 1622. Inspectors noted she never moved, always met posture standard, and was exceptionally silent. Eventually, an audit revealed she did not exist. But by then, her profile had been used to justify several policy decisions, including a brief easing of restrictions on girls with identical behavioral alignment. Elsbeta had never drawn breath, but her stillness shaped policy, and then came the breaking point in 1624. A report from the Office of Domestic Integrity revealed that nearly 12% of bed check forms had been falsified, not just by girls, but by staff members, wardens, even schoolmasters. The report concluded, the system may be observing itself. That sentence, strange, bureaucratic, and unintentional, marked the beginning of the system's collapse. Within a year, the scoring system was suspended. 2 years later, the bed check itself was no longer mandatory. By 1627, the Office of Domestic Integrity was absorbed into the larger Civic Hygiene Bureau. Its ledgers were boxed, shelved, forgotten. What remains are fragments. A pillow embroidered with the phrase, "I folded my hands, but not my thoughts." A copybook with alternating pages blank and full. When they looked, I slept. When they left, I wrote. A quilt signed beneath the lining with 27 initials. No names, no messages, just the quiet mark of girls who wanted to be recorded in some way that wasn't a checkbox. And so, we ask, as always, what does it mean when the stillest girl is the one thinking most? What happens when you teach someone that quiet is safety, and they learn to be silent, even in revolt? Asterisk, by the end of 1627. The nightly bed check-in Krakow had begun to vanish, not because of rebellion, not because of mercy, but because it had become logistically unsustainable. The Office of Domestic Integrity, the crown jewel of moral record-keeping in the polished Lithuanian Commonwealth, had choked on its own precision. The ledgers grew too many, the forms too dense, contradictions too obvious, and the girls, they had learned to make silence their own. Inside the archive today, the records of the final year are striking in one detail. Empty rows, a girl's name appears at the top. The date is marked, the inspection time noted. Cool, but the field's posture, sheet status, latch condition, name response, Some left blank by mistake, some deliberately. One file for a girl named Edita L. includes a note in the warden's hand. Came to her door. She looked at me. I did not ask. I did not write. The next night's form, blank again. Then the next, and then her name is gone. Perhaps she left. Perhaps the warden stopped recording. Perhaps both. No one followed up, because by now, even the inspectors had grown tired. Some had started skipping halls. Others reused old forms. One particularly wary clerk was found to have filled out an entire month's worth of reports for a girls' school before the month had even begun, basing his scores on the previous year's averages. When confronted, he replied, "They sleep. They always sleep. Nothing changes." But of course, things had changed. The girls had learned how to be still and how to pretend, and more importantly, how to record themselves. It started in a school near Wall Hill, where girls began sewing minute initials into the hems of their bed sheets, just 3 letters, NVP, standing for Knee W Papieres Not in the paper. It was a protest, quiet but persistent. From there, a network formed. Messages were passed during washing on laundry tags. In dust written beneath bedposts, one set of messages, recovered years later, reads like this: "They track our stillness, not our questions. Okay? I breathe how they want, but think how I please. The only sleep they trust is the kind that forgets." And then, in darker thread, let them record the room, not the girl inside. Some girls even created false ledgers of their own. They copied the inspection forms and rewrote their own scores, but backwards. P, G, voice growing mount, mind turning, GS girl still. But watching these joke forms were hidden behind wall panels, beneath mattresses, even folded into hymn books, returned to the chapel shelves. A few were discovered. One school official commented in the margin, "The girls mimic us. Tired, think they've been listening too well." Eventually, the government moved on. The Office of Domestic Integrity was quietly closed in 1628. Its responsibilities were scattered between 3 other departments. No public announcement was made. The ledgers were stored in crates and sent to a damp hall beneath the city granary, where many rotted or were used for kindling. But the girls remembered. Even decades later, keen women who had passed through the bed check system wrote about it carefully in private memoirs. In side notes, Helena S., who became a teacher in Poznań, wrote, "I taught my girls to fold their hands for prayer, not for inspection. But I still sleep with my legs straight, my breath slow, in case someone knocks." Dorada W., who joined a Carmelite convent, confessed to keeping her latch sealed every night long after no one was watching. Habit becomes belief. I open the door in the morning and think I passed again. Today, if you walk through Krakow's old districts, few traces remain. The schools have changed hands. The house of soothing became a hospital, then a bakery, then apartments. The bed check forms, those that remain are brittle and fading. But once, a thin drawer beneath the chapel altar, archivists discovered a girl's mattress tag sewn with unusual thread. The cloth read, "I was here. I did not sleep. I remembered everything." And so, as we close this story, we linger on a final, unanswered thought. What happens to a generation taught that sleep is safety, but whose dreams were monitored like crimes? They do not rebel loudly. They do not protest in daylight. They do not run. They wait. And when the paper stops arriving, when the bell stops ringing, they begin to write their own names again. This time, not for someone else's ledger, asterisk in the French city of Bordeaux during the waning years of the 17th century. The smooth clatter of ledgers and linen filled the air as surely as the scent of wine casks in wet earth. The Garonne River flowed wide and slow through the port, and in the crowded quartiers behind the docks, girls were counted not by their names, by their BEDCLOTH. It began with a reform in 1684. Under pressure from civic authorities to tighten oversight of indigent wards, the Hospice de Vieux de Carite, Bordeaux's largest charitable home for orphaned and unclaimed girls, implemented a new policy. Every girl must be matched to her linen. The premise was simple. Each girl, upon admission, was assigned one coarse cotton sheet, one woolen underblanket, one shift, stamped with initials of the hospice, and one linen top sheet, marked with a unique thread pattern stitched in red, green, or brown. This sheet was to remain with her, washed and rotated weekly for as long as she stayed. It was logged under her entry in the hospice's register of textile propriety, a document that soon held more power than her baptismal record or schooling history, because if the sheet went missing, or was found soiled, or was mixed up, the girl would be penalized, not just with chores or prayers, but with recorded suspicion. Why sheets? In part, because the linen was expensive. The hospice had recently entered into a contract with the Regional Weavers Guild, but the cost of maintaining, laundering, and replacing sheets became a pressing concern. But beneath the economics lay deeper assumption. A girl who cannot guard her linen cannot guard her virtue. It's that phrase, recorded in the administrative guidelines of the Maison de Moderation, echoed through the halls. So the policy spread, first in the hospice, then to affiliated boarding houses, then to parochial schools and even small convent dormitories. By 1686, nearly every institution housing young girls in Bordeaux adhered to the linen inventory system. Each week, at sunrise on Fridays, witches performed the tour de drapes, the sheet round. They entered each dormitory with a wooden box containing spools of reference thread and a bound volume of linen codes. One by one, each girl would lift her sheet's edge and expose the tag stitched into the corner. The matron would cross-check the thread pattern off in a knot sequence in red and white against the ledger. Any irregularity, no matter how small, was recorded. A faded thread could mean neglect, a missing tag, tampering, misaligned, stitch, attempt to disguise, a wet or stained sheet, even from spilled water, improper use, no sheet at all, moral risk. Investigation warranted.